Coming up on The Daily with me, Neil Patterson. Donald Trump is talking tariffs. The US president is threatening to whack massive costs on goods coming from its closest neighbours, Canada and Mexico. But why?
Donald Trump is heading back to the White House.
Together we can truly make America great again.
We are in for an unpredictable but fascinating 4 years.
And we're going to be following every twist and turn for the first 100 days. We'll be bringing you the latest updates and analysis first thing every morning. So join me, James Matthews.
Me, Martha Kellner.
And me, Mark Stone.
For Trump 100, every weekday at 6 a.m, wherever you get your podcasts.
Well, you certainly can't accuse Donald Trump of having a quiet first few weeks in office. Immigration, the Middle East, diversity, and now trade. Complaining of illegal drugs coming over the United States northern border and criminals and ne'er-do-wells from the south, the president's threatening significant tariffs on goods from Canada and Mexico, its two closest neighbours and trading partners. There is a deadline of sorts in place of Saturday. We're recording on Friday, so look, a decision may very well have been made by the time you're listening to this. So yeah, we are going to be looking at the possible effects of action on Canada, but also explore just why Donald Trump is so smitten with the whole idea of tariffs in general. Our economics editor, Ed Conway, back on The Daily. Good to see you, mate.
You too.
I mean, first things first, tariffs, what are they?
Basically, it is kind of a tax on any goods that are coming into the country. It says if you're sending something into our country, you're going to have to pay X% on top of it. And the idea is it's a bit of protectionism. So it's protection for your domestic producers. Mm-hmm. It's a diplomatic weapon, and that's one thing that Donald Trump is using it for. And it's also, potentially a way of trying to create a kind of conversation about how to make the global trading system work a bit more functionally.
I mean, is it entirely uncommon?
They've become less and less common. So if you look back over the course of the last kind of 20, 30 years, really like since the fall of the Berlin Wall, and chart that, you just see a line going down and down and down, up until Donald Trump came into office last time around. And if you talk to any economists, they will say tariffs are terrible. They would say they're an awful idea because they raise inflation. They don't necessarily improve your kind of ability to make stuff. And that's been a really powerful convention of wisdom that goes all the way back to the past kind of 30, 40 years. It's part of what people would call the Washington consensus, neoliberalism. But I do think there is an interesting conversation right now about whether that setup has actually delivered the kind of benefits that a lot of people said it would at the time.
I mean, that conversation clearly being driven by one D. Trump sitting at Pennsylvania Avenue.
He wouldn't put it like that, obviously.
No, of course not. But he has put it in a number of ways in the past. Well, he's put his support for tariffs in a number of ways over a number of years. He's a big fan.
Yeah, he loves tariffs. He's loved them for a long time. In the same way that he loves tariffs, he hates the idea of having a deficit in your trade with the rest of the world. And what is that? It's basically where you're sucking in more imports than you are sending out exports around the world. And the US, he used to send out far more goods, whether it's cars or refrigerators or whatever it is, around the world than it sucked in. But as of the last kind of 50 years or so, it has had a big deficit. And that deficit, as here in the UK, has got bigger and bigger. And over time, Donald Trump finds that very disconcerting. I think it's all very well being very, very much in favour of free trade and saying tariffs are a bad thing. But if you look at the way that the global economy functions right now, if you look at China's dominance when it comes to trade, if you look at the implications that's had for parts of America where manufacturing was a big part of local communities. The Rust Belt. If you look at parts of the UK, look in the north of the UK where we used to manufacture far more than we do now. Look at steel towns, and they can't compete anymore because it is very difficult to compete with China. That is not necessarily just because China's really good at making steel cheaply. It's also because Chinese producers are subsidised in a way that American and UK producers aren't. So I think there is a genuine, interesting, fundamental conversation about where this has left us and where it's left those left behind towns in this country, which needs to be had. And I know that's not exactly the sophisticated debate that Donald Trump's having, but I think this is a prompt to try and have that conversation, I think.
Well, conversations clearly going to be taking place in the capitals of Mexico and Canada currently, and potentially also Colombia. Just explain exactly what Donald Trump's plan is. Again, bearing in mind you and I are talking on Friday, a day ahead of the deadline.
Yeah, anything could happen. I think that's the big overarching thing to have in your head over the course of the next 4 years. We've been through this before. This will be chaotic. There will be lots of threats and promises that maybe don't come off. I mean, we already had the shortest run trade war in history, which was with Colombia, which lasted, I think, 12 hours, where there was a disagreement between Colombia and the US about accepting people coming back into Colombia. And Donald Trump says, look, right, we're slapping tariffs on you. In a matter of hours, really, the Colombian president kind of turned around and Donald Trump said, it's okay, I'm not going to put those tariffs on you. Now the main focus, and this has always been his focus actually, since before the election, is on Canada and Mexico, which is quite interesting because remember last time around, it was mostly China that was getting slapped with tariffs or getting threatened with tariffs. And that did happen.
Okay, so let's park China, let's park Colombia, just for the time being anyway. But when it comes to Mexico, when it comes to Canada, I mean, isn't what the US president's trying to do is affect public policy change there, domestically, in Canada? He wants to see tougher action taken on illegal drugs, fentanyl coming over the border. And as regards Mexico, he wants to see an end to criminals coming over that border.
It's partly that. But actually, when you listen to what he says about this, number one, he just doesn't like the deficits. So the US has a big deficit with Mexico, has a big deficit with Canada, and for that matter, with China. He wants to try to eliminate those deficits. And then there's the opioids that are coming across the border. There's the illegal migration and so on. That's the thing. Tariffs can be used as a form of negotiation tactic, and he clearly wants to do that. And I mean, part of the reason for that, why is he doing this? It's because he has the power to impose tariffs. So Congress gives the president, this power to impose these things over a course of time. And so he's not reliant on the Senate, he's not reliant on Congress to actually impose these things. So he wants to use that big weapon and he wants to smack it as much as possible. Whether the stuff gets imposed or not, like I say, we'll have to see. It didn't get imposed on Colombia because they kind of came out.
But isn't there another reason for this? And that is that Trump, looking at the history books, I mean, he said this explicitly, he believes that tariffs built America. And you've been looking into this.
Yeah, I mean, he's right. He's right about this. And I think people that dispute this have forgotten history. They've forgotten what happened in the past. America's economy was built on tariffs. It was built on tariffs. Alexander Hamilton, when he came in, I mean, he wasn't just famous for being in the musical. Alexander Hamilton, one of the most important things he did, which wasn't in the musical, and I think is a great omission, was that he came up with this big report on manufacturers and industries, basically saying, if we want to be a great country, we need not just to focus on things like agriculture and growing cotton and corn and all of that stuff. We need to build the industries of the future. And that means we need to impose big tariffs on, mostly it was England at the time, and it means we need to protect our nascent industries. And that is a big part of how America began to grow and began to become a kind of wealthy economy. It was tariffs. Tariffs were there. And if you look back through the history of America, for the first kind of at least century or so, the vast majority of the way it raised money was tariffs.
There were some fairly significant differences between the government of Hamilton's time and the government of Donald Trump's second term in office. The size of the government, for one thing.
One of the things Donald Trump has said is it's really upsetting that we now have to raise all of our money through income tax. It used to all be raised through tariffs. And again, that is true.
A multimillionaire who wants to pay less income tax. I've never heard that before. Yeah.
Ironically, isn't it? But obviously, the world has changed a lot since then.
Yeah.
And the thing that changed, so during the Civil War, America began to impose taxes on the domestic population, so duties and income tax. And gradually over time, as the size of the American welfare state, which is smaller, much smaller than we have over here in Europe, got bigger, income taxes had to step in. You can't run a modern state, even one with a relatively small state like America. There's no way you can run that without some form of taxes on the domestic population.
Sure. But we do have one concrete kind of example of Donald Trump imposing tariffs, and that is whilst in office, whilst in the White House, and that was with China in the first term. How did that go?
Well, I mean, there was a whole range of tariffs imposed on China. It was mostly on specific types of goods. Okay, so that's one of the big differences here. He's talking about blanket tariffs on kind of all things, really. Last time around, he was talking about specific goods.
Washing machines, one of them.
Yeah, kind of washing machines. Certain things were excluded, but certain things were included. So I think Apple lobbied the White House and said, please don't include iPhones in there. And so iPhones were excluded. Tariffs were imposed on China. China, in turn, imposed some retaliatory tariffs and sanctions on the US. So certain things like germanium and certain materials became harder to get those things in the US. What was the impact of it? Well, actually, the US deficit with China did go down a bit. But did that mean that, was that improving America's position in the world? Not really. At the same time, and this brings us back to kind of Mexico and Canada, at the same time, the deficit with Canada and with Mexico went up. It wasn't like America was becoming much more self-sufficient. It was just importing more stuff from elsewhere. And actually, a lot of people look at those flows of trade and say, well, hang on, maybe some of the stuff that previously was going directly from China to America is now going from China to another country, maybe Mexico, and then going in to America. All of which is why I think Mexico and Canada have been at the top of his list, because he sees them as being potential conduits, aside from the stuff about fentanyl, fentanyl and all of the different kind of the migration things. It's that he sees those as being a conduit. But the problem here, and again, the big disparity is, this time he's threatening tariffs on his allies in a much more kind of wide-ranging way than he was before.
I mean, is he just simply being a bully? I mean, I know a number of leading economists have suggested this,
Yeah.
but of course he is the United States president.
Well, no,
I mean, any action he takes, you're going to be the smaller partner in the equation, whoever you are.
It is a form of economic bullying. And that's the nature. And unfortunately, it's done in a particularly brutal way rather than in a particularly reasonable way. As I say, there are very sensible conversations we need to have about the relationship between America and China, because that is the most important economic relationship in the world. There's a sensible conversation we need to have about places that are left behind. But instead, all of that gets kind of thrown out and we just have this, I love tariffs, I'm going to impose this, it's used as a weapon, and it is a form of bullying. And that's an irrational world that we're living in.
Ed, we're just going to pause there. When we come back, we will be focusing on what the world might look like if Trump has his way with tariffs.
Donald Trump is heading back to the White House.
Together we can truly make America great again.
We are in for an unpredictable but fascinating 4 years.
And we're going to be following every twist and turn for the first 100 days. We'll be bringing you the latest updates and analysis first thing every morning. So join me, James Matthews.
Me, Martha Kellner.
And me, Mark Stone.
For Trump 100, every weekday at 6 a.m, wherever you get your podcasts.
Our economics editor, Ed Conway, still with me as we discuss Mexico, Canada, Donald Trump, tariffs. I mean, look, we've touched on this already, but Donald Trump thinks tariffs are a good idea. For the US consumer, doesn't it mean one thing and one thing alone? They will be spending more to buy products that come from overseas. It's a very simple equation, isn't it?
Yeah, the consumer ends up paying more. There is an interesting debate thereafter about whether it means that your domestic producers, so let's say there's a widget you've been getting from China for all this time, suddenly there's a massive tariff on it. There might be some producers in the US who say suddenly, oh, hang on, we can actually afford to make this for cheaper than the cost would be when you're getting something in from China, and they start making something. The thing is that doesn't happen immediately. And
there's a lag factor. There's a massive lag.
There's a massive lag.
You've got to build a factory first.
And in the short run, your consumers are hit with higher prices because stuff that was previously available for cheap from China and from Mexico and from Canada is suddenly more expensive. And that in turn can affect your gross domestic product. So just how much money you're earning as a country. And if you look at any of the simple projections, and right now, two provisos. First of all, we don't actually know precisely what he's going to do
or
tomorrow, the day after.
Yeah.
Things you just have to be kind of cautious about that. But secondly, these models are very crude, but they basically show it would be bad for Mexico. It would take a big hit on its economy. It would be bad for Canada. It would take a big hit on its economy as well. It would be a little bad for the US, but nowhere near as bad as it is for those other countries.
Just describe the world after those tariffs. I mean, presumably Canada, Mexico, I mean, any country or institution, of course, he's also looking at the European Union, we need to bear in mind, but any organisation or any country which has these tariffs imposed on them, they just do the same back, don't they? And we find ourselves in what I believe is known as a trade war.
Well, potentially. And you could...
Is that a bad thing?
Well, yeah, trade wars are not great things. No.
Explain why. I know that sounds like a daft question, but why?
Because the kind of scary scenario is Trump imposes tariffs. Other countries around the world would retaliate. The retaliation just carries on. You get this kind of spiral of various different countries imposing extra tariffs on each other. The world of globalization that we're familiar with just gums up, and everyone gets poorer. And then as they get poorer, they get more frustrated. You get more nationalism. And this is exactly what happened in the 1930s. And the world ended up at war with each other. It is a very, very scary path. And yes, we are basically on a potential of that path. There is a kind of another scenario which says that we have a dysfunctional global economy right now at the moment. You've got massive imbalances. And when I talk about imbalances, that's basically what we're talking about. It's trade deficits, trade surpluses. China has an enormous surplus with the rest of the world. Germany has a large surplus with the rest of the world. That's pretty dysfunctional. It's dysfunctional that we in the UK have a massive, massive deficit with the rest of the world. It's not necessarily the normal order of things. And there might well be a better way of everyone getting together and having a conversation and working out how to align their affairs so we don't have these imbalances in the future. And the interesting thing is that is precisely the conversation that Trump's Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, wants to have. So there is a positive kind of thing, which is like, we've got a dysfunctional world. We need to talk about it. We need to sort things out. We need to deal with this. And the tariffs just kind of get you there.
But this is something we've talked about on the podcast before, the move from the age of globalisation to the age of protectionism. I mean, isn't it, from what you're saying there, this process has already started. Donald Trump might be driving it, but actually another alternative way of looking at it is Donald Trump spotted this and he is getting in early. He is getting his digs in, he's getting his punches in early because he knows that this is the way the world is going.
I kind of think of Donald Trump as like one of the jesters or the fools in a Shakespeare play. And this is not to say he's a fool, although I know some people think he is. But the point is, when you listen to what the fool is saying in Shakespeare play, they're often making a joke. It's often funny. They often sound ridiculous. But the whole point of them is they are being more truthful and honest and rational than the rest of the cast. All those kings and queens and seemingly wise people, they are nowhere near as wise as the fool because the fool calls them out. And in a way, I think, for all that he's not a lot of people's cup of tea, Donald Trump is doing this thing of calling out these problems in the global economy that the conventional economists just don't want to talk about. I think, Brexit is another kind of example of this. Everyone dismisses the conversation about Brexit. And I think you can make totally reasonable points about how much worse off we are as a result of it. But it's still worth having the conversation about it. And it's still an issue which points to some deeper, inequalities in society that we haven't talked about for a long time, and which comes back to trade and it comes back to our relationship with the rest of the world.
But this is not a path without danger for the United States. I understand that they're not going to be scared about picking a trade war with Colombia, of all places. But if the European Union stands as one, that could cause them some problems. And if China, with the scale of its economy, decides to cause Donald Trump some problems, they certainly can as well.
Totally. And China now, it's a bigger economy than it was 4 or 5 years ago when Donald Trump was last dealing with them. It has more ability to go outside of the American financial system, the dollar system. You've got Russia as well. There are many countries around the world who would be delighted if the current system of global hegemony, with America in the middle, with the dollar as the global currency, if that system, which has presided for the last kind of, 70, 80 years, if that system basically came to an end and you had a very different world with, Russia more prominent, with China more prominent, Europe is massively embattled at the moment. It has all sorts of problems. So what Europe does is really consequential because they are one of the biggest markets. And, back to us, I don't want to be too parochial, but back to the UK, what we do is interesting.
Is it possible that this is all just about Donald Trump's love of the deal? That he likes seeing outcomes, that he likes getting one over on people, and as a businessman as much as a politician, that he is just using these tariffs right now to secure some competitive advantage that he wouldn't have had without them.
He's a disruptor and he's disrupting politics right now. And it's uncomfortable and everyone is trying to interpret his actions in the way that they would most like them to be interpreted. And so you have all these different theses of where this might take us that are kind of knocking around.
Best guess?
Well, I I mean, I think your guess is probably your point. He basically likes the deal. He wants to come out and say that he has secured a great deal.
Again.
He loves real estate.
He does.
So, what's the best real estate in the deal? Greenland.
It's amazing, isn't it?
And Panama. He wants to kind of have a lot of these conversations. But like I say, somewhere beneath them are some interesting dialogues that we could have. I wish we'd have them in a more civilized way than Donald Trump has them. But they are conversations actually that have been mostly buried under the carpet for decades and decades. And actually it is about time that we talked about this kind of stuff.
Especially on a podcast. Ed Conway, always great to have you on. Thanks very much. And that is your lot for this edition of The Daily. As mentioned, we're recording this episode on Friday, so a decision may very well have been made on Mexico and Canada. Just head to skynews.com to find out. We are back again on Monday. Have a lovely weekend.
Donald Trump is heading back to the White House.
Together we can truly make America great again.
We are in for an unpredictable but fascinating 4 years.
And we're going to be following every twist and turn for the first 100 days. We'll be bringing you the latest updates and analysis first thing every morning. So join me, James Matthews.
Me, Martha Kelnick.
And me, Mark Stone.
For Trump 100 every weekday at 6 a.m, wherever you get your podcasts.